Good morning, everyone. Bom dia, and thank you for joining us today. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's discussion, Mapping President-elect Lula's First 100 Days, which, of course, we plan to coincide with Brazil advancing to the knockout stage of the World Cup yesterday. I'm Jason Marzek, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arsht Latin America Center. It's been about a month since President Lula was elected again as Brazil's president on October 30th, and we're now going to turn our heads to Inauguration Day, but also Lula's first days in office. During COP27 earlier this month, President Lula made clear that Brazil will have a noticeably different foreign policy and environmental policy under his administration. In Egypt, Lula announced that, quote, Brazil is back, promising to reduce deforestation and further promote South-South cooperation. The expectations are high domestically and internationally for the incoming government to deliver on many of its key campaign promises, from addressing hunger and poverty and reigniting economic growth while also being fiscally responsible to significantly reducing deforestation rates in the Amazon while establishing more ambitious climate goals. Yet it remains to be seen what these pledges mean in practice and what obstacles or opportunities, even better, await Lula's term. The new administration will face a country split in half, a more conservative Congress, and a government under the microscope. As the transition begins to take shape further and expectations rise for what will be the composition of Lula's cabinet, we're beginning to have a clear understanding of what Lula's third term in office might look like, what might be the priorities, and also what will help to drive those priorities forward. Looking forward to January 1st, which is Inauguration Day in Brazil, what can we expect from President-elect Lula's first 100 days in office? How will the incoming administration manage expectations, very high expectations, in a globally challenging geopolitical and economic context? And in what ways will Brazil's next government work with the international community on key global issues like climate change and food security? With us to discuss these topics today is an excellent lineup of experts. We go ahead and introduce them now. Hussein Khallout is the former Special Secretary for Strategic Affairs of Brazil, editor-in-chief of the Sudbury Journal, and a research scholar at Harvard University, actually joining us from Boston. Hussein also provided ad hoc advice for President-elect Lula's campaign. Mariana Fali is a co-founder and program director of Plataforma CIPO, a Brazilian independent and women-led policy institute focusing on climate, governance, and peace building in Latin America and the Caribbean. And Mariana Diaz is a journalist and former U.S. correspondent of Folha de Sao Paulo, who is covering the elections of Brazil and joins us from there today. So welcome, Hussein, AC LATAM, and using the hashtag AC Brazil. So now to lead what I know will be an incredibly vibrant, important, and engaging discussion, I'd like to turn over to my colleague, Valentina Sater.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Marina, Mayara, Hussein, for joining us today. I don't want to take up any more time, so I want to start the conversation because there's a lot for us to cover. Marina, I wanted to start with you. It's been almost a month since October 30th when Lula won the election against President Bolsonaro. Since then, we saw protests erupt across Brazil. We saw questioning over the result of the election and announcements of the composition of a transition government. You are in Brazil right now, in Rio. We are all jealous that you're there. But what has the environment been like since election day? What are some of the expectations for the next month, especially as we look toward Inauguration Day on January 1st?
Okay, thank you, Valentina. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure to discuss Brazil with you and Hussein and Mayara. So yes, I've been here in Brazil since the first round of the election. And yes, we have seen protests around the country. Illegal protests, let's make it clear. Because people are denying the results of the election and they are asking for military intervention. And here in Brazil, asking for military intervention is a crime. So they are illegal protests. That said, what has happened since Lula's victory? So Bolsonaro never formally conceded. He has not been working. He's mostly in silence. And in some way, this is gasoline for his supporters that are in the streets. So this is what Bolsonaro wants. You know, he is not sure about what is going to happen, but he wants to show that he still has some popular support that could be more radical, let's say that. So yes, it is a tense atmosphere. And first, those people were blocking roads around the country, but now they are mostly in front of military headquarters. It does not seem that they will get something concrete, but more protests can be expected for Inauguration Day, for example, in January 1st. First, Lula's team was concerned about the situation, and Lula himself was concerned about Bolsonaro contesting the results with military help. But more than that, Lula was concerned about the number of people on the streets growing and creating more and more chaos for the transition and the Inauguration Day. But the thing is, the military did not find anything wrong with the ballots. Bolsonaro's party presented a report last week asking for canceling some ballots from the second round of the election, but the Electoral Court rejected. So the situation now is that the Electoral Court is making sure that the results of the election were clean, were fair, and there is no possibility of contesting the election. And Lula is sure that the transition will happen, it is happening, and he's also sure that the Inauguration Day will happen. But people are still on the streets. So they are not a huge number, but they are there. There are a few cases of violence. So we are not sure if it's enough for something big on the Inauguration Day, but everybody are on alert.
Thank you, Marina. Hussein, I wanted to turn to you, as you've been, you used to be in government and you are very much related to foreign policy in general. What does the current composition of the transition government tell us about President Lula's priorities, especially with regards to foreign policy?
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning and to see a dear and great friend among us today. Well, Valentina, I would say President Lula across the last few months, he has emphasized that political stability is a priority, that economic growth is another important pillar of his administration. Beside that, also the deforestation, combating deforestation and improving the social policies program in order to combat hungerness and poverty. So basically, he has indicated that there are four main pillars in his future administration. The matter of fact, of course, the foreign policy has to reflect on those demands, right? So foreign policy, you cannot just make it because you want to make it, but has also to address those concerns, how foreign policy will contribute to help the economic stability, how foreign policy will be addressed in order to reduce social inequality, how foreign policy will be a gateway to improve Brazilian reputation and image across the world, particularly in what related to the Amazon. So I mean, foreign policy in itself has its own dimension, but also more than ever, the foreign policy will, in my opinion, reflect these concerns. If you want to make a foreign policy, and the foreign policy does not address economic stability, does not address reduction of inequality, does not address the priority lines of sustainable development, so why foreign policy exists, right? So I mean, foreign policy is also is an expression about the legitimate popular vote and about the current project of the president. In this transition, President Lula has made it clear, in my opinion, that Brazil will have a pragmatic and a realistic foreign policy, right? Based on the Brazilian national interest and also based on the population demand. And that's what is really important. That could be seen in the bilateral relation with the US, either with the bilateral relation with China, either in the multilateral fora, especially in the UN, and the interregional fora too. So it's still time to debate in a more accurate way the technicality of all aspects of foreign policy. But in general, that's what I can say to you.
I wanted to, before moving to Mayara, I wanted to invite everyone joining us to please, if you want to participate in the conversation, you can send us questions via the Q&A feature if you're joining us via Zoom. And if you're joining us or seeing us on YouTube or Twitter, please use the hashtag ACBrazil to submit your questions, and we'll be asking questions to our panelists. Mayara, I think that Hussein already alluded to this in terms of President Lula's campaign in government having the priority of the environment, not only domestically, but also in terms of foreign policy. You were just in Egypt for COP27, and all eyes were on President Lula there. What can we expect from this new government on that front, on the environmental front?
Thank you, Valentina, for the question, but also for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I believe that the fact that Lula has chosen to attend the climate summit as his first international trip as president-elect, and also considering the speech that he gave there, which our organization Plataforma Cipó has provided inputs for, I think it's fair to say that climate issues will be at the core of Brazil's foreign policy. It is true that Brazil historically has been an important player in the area. It hosted some landmark events such as Eco 92 in Rio, also Rio +20. Brazil has also played an important role in a lot of international negotiations in climate, including the Paris Agreement in 2015. But climate has never been at the core of Brazil's international insertion strategy. And Lula has given signs that he's willing to change that, and including by announcing, you've probably seen, the intention for Brazil to host COP20 in 2025 in a Brazilian Amazon state, and also by indicating that he will make use of Brazil's presidency of the G20 in 2024 to make sure that the climate agenda continues and is elevated in the agenda of the world's largest economies. And I'd say that from considering Lula's remarks at COP, this process of elevating the priority that he gives to climate and environmental issues, I'd say that this will undoubtedly have a strong regional emphasis. And in that regard, he has announced, for instance, a summit between the members of the Amazon Cooperation Treaty. And in the words of Lula himself, this summit will be an opportunity for Brazil, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Guyana, Peru, Suriname, and Venezuela for the first time to discuss the promotion of Amazon's regional development with social inclusion, but also climate responsibility at its core. And thirdly, I'd say that Brazil's international strategy, and here I say within climate, but also beyond this topic, will be marked by the traditional defense of multilateralism and the reform of key global governance structure. Lula, while in Egypt, has not only repeatedly talked about the need for reform of the UN Security Council, which is something that Brazil has historically embraced, but he has also been talking a lot about the need for reforms of climate and environmental mechanisms within and beyond the UN. And his intention here, and he says openly, is that he believes that countries there needs to be mechanisms to make sure that countries can be held accountable when they fail to implement at the domestic level the commitments that they have agreed internationally. So in a nutshell, I think we can expect climate, regional cooperation, multilateralism, and global governance reform to be at the core of Brazil's foreign policy under a Lula government.
I think that one of the points that we have all been speaking and hearing about is how the expectations, both domestically and internationally, are incredibly high with regards to Lula's government. And Lula has spoken about this, saying that scares him. Marina, how will the incoming administration manage these expectations, especially when we think about the fact that this is such a globally challenging geopolitical and economic context?
Yes. So Lula said that in an interview 2 weeks ago for me and John Lee Anderson from the New Yorker magazine. And I was surprised when he said this scared me because we are not used to see Lula saying something about that, you know, like he doesn't show this. He doesn't show that he's scary about something. And when we asked, look, the expectations are high. How do you feel about it? And it was before his trip to COP27, and he said that. So it was his first interview as president-elected. And I think he said that because people are very optimistic about his government. And he said that after talking to the leaders around the globe, including President Biden. Marina Silva, I like the expression that Mayara used it to talk about environment. It will be the core of his foreign policy. And it will be. Marina Silva told me that she finally realized that Lula learned that he has to put the environment in the center of his foreign policy, and he will do it. But I think he has a concern or something around him that he needs to show that he is aware that it's a lot, because he left his term in 2010. You remember that, with 87% of approval. And he knows that it will never happen again over like this divided country that Brazil is now. But he wants to make the economy better, for example, for poor people. This is his main goal internally, like domestically. And with that, he will try to change the context in Brazil. So I think Lula knows that people are expecting a lot about him. Lula knows that people are expecting that something will change, and it will, like he is different than Bolsonaro. And internationally, he will try to make important moves, basically about environment, Amazon, of course, as Mayara was saying. And he also will try to bring Brazil back to the international stage to discuss fake news and even the war in the Ukraine. So I think he's managing these expectations like that. I want to be a player again, and about Amazon, about climate change, about fake news, about war in the Ukraine, I can talk. So I think he's balancing this, you know, like you can count on me. I will be a player again. Brazil will be a player again. He's trying to do this. The first sign is this one, in my opinion.
Hussein, on that note, actually, many have argued that Brazil has, in past years, become diplomatic isolated. And amid global priorities on climate and energy fronts, challenges with food security and supply chain, among other factors, the expectations are high for the role that Brazil can play in the global stage under Lula, like Marina was mentioning. How do you think that President Lula will seek to reestablish Brazil's position within Latin America and the Caribbean, and as well as globally?
Wow, this is a $1 million secret. I mean, that depends, of course, who's going to be the foreign minister and who's going to advise him on foreign policy, because depending on the type and the nature of the advices, that will definitely label the framework of his strategy toward the world and toward the region, right? So depending what kind of vision you want to implement across the region or across the globe. I want to go 2 steps back before to jump specifically in your question. I think since 1992, the topic of environment has been a core in the Brazil's foreign policy, right? I don't think this is something new. I think what is going on now, it's the Brazilian government is making more emphasis on that. Since 1992, when Brazil organized the first UN conference called Eco 92 in Rio, that has been a watermark in Brazil's foreign policy. And afterwards, either in the Conference of Copenhagen or in Paris, Brazil has been vocal, has been active, and Brazil since then, especially during Lula's government, I think they had a very aggressive environmental policy, right? By reducing deforestation and creating new regulatory mark for the protection of the Amazon and the biodiversity. So what has changed actually, Bolsonaro has destroyed all those policies, has destroyed Brazil's reputation. And now, rather than before, the topic of climate change became crucial in the world stage, right? So the leverage of this topic replaced other agenda as the main agenda on the international stage, which that gives Brazil actually the potential to play a wider role and more efficient role by helping to frame a new geopolitical climate change order, right? That said, what I would say is Latin America is crucial to Brazil, South America in particular. If you, Brazil has to know how to restructure its role in the region and why for, right? I think the environment topic is a crucial topic, but that is not sufficient in my perception. Of course, when you go to the multiple layer and the multiple dimensions on foreign policy, South America has more weight in the Brazilian geopolitical dimension strategy rather than the Caribbean one, right? So it's more closer, it's more concerned to the Brazilian national security, is more tied to our immediate national interests, right? So depends on which kind of aspect when we talk about Latin America and the Caribbean or South America, right? So we have to separate each context by, and each context has its own political variables to deal with it, right? When we go globally, I think the world needs leaders, right? And I think today we lack a strong leadership, either in the countries in development or in the countries or in the developed countries, right? So I think Lula will have definitely a wider role, not only regionally, but globally. Based on his experience, based on his potential to negotiate, based on his trajectory in the Southern globe. So my perception is there is a huge expectation about the first 3 months, the 100-day, whatever. Same expectation that people has in the beginning with Biden government after Trump, right? After every destruction, you have to have a hope and expectation about what will be the path forward, how you're going to rebuild a country, right? But the challenge is huge, either to contain social disturbance, either to reorganize political stability. And I think we should be fair with our expectation, because what Lula gonna face is a totally destroyed country and totally obliterated institution. And that requires a lot of effort to restore all of it in 3 months. It's huge work. And I don't think that will be possible for the first 3 months, right? I think that will come in the years ahead during his mandate. And that actually also will depend on how we're gonna build and frame a coalition in the parliament, because that is also crucial for the implementation of public policy at large, right? And that will definitely impact in the balance of the government.
Going off of that, I think that one of the things that we've been hearing more and more is, again, like this expectation that everyone has towards the Lula administration, but lots of questions on how President Lula will be able to deliver on most of these promises. And Mayara, perhaps one of the most anticipated changes from the Lula administration is with regards to the Amazon, curbing deforestation, protecting indigenous communities, and sustainably developing that region. Lula's attendance and speech at COP27 earlier this month, Germany's and Norway's recommitment to the Amazon Fund, and the Rainforest Protection Pact with Indonesia and Congo are already signs that we'll see changes towards the Amazon. But what will these changes actually look like? How will Lula work with Congress that we know is highly divided and potentially more conservative in a way to ensure that these priorities are met?
Thank you, Valentina. Just before I answer to you, I'll just react quickly to Hussein's comment. It is true, as I was saying before, Brazil has always been an active player in the climate area. We've hosted a series of important UN meetings. We have played important roles in negotiations, but this has been mainly confined to the spaces of climate. Brazil hasn't made much use of other areas of foreign policy to feature the issue of climate. It hasn't been the player telling the G20 countries that climate needs to be discussed and it needs to be a priority in G20 discussions. It hasn't done so when we talk about fight against poverty, in peace discussions. And I think this is the key difference now. It's recognizing that the problem is, the response to the problem needs to be transversal, that so mainstreaming the climate agenda and in all aspects and areas of foreign policy, I think that's the key difference. And I don't think we have seen that before from previous administration, including by Dilma Rousseff and Lula himself. But coming back to your question then, Valentina, well, as we were saying, Lula is an experienced politician, and he's well aware that in order to reconquer Brazil's international credibility, it will be necessary to cut down on deforestation in all Brazilian biomes, but especially in the Amazon. And I think there are many things that will need to be done. The challenge is huge, as Hussein was saying. The scenario that we encountered is much more challenging than in the past. But I think there are three things that must be done immediately, and I hope will likely be done immediately to help with cutting down deforestation. The first thing, which I believe Lula is likely to do in his first day in office, is to revoke firstly, and hopefully replace the hundreds of presidential decrees and other regulatory measures that were introduced by Bolsonaro's administration, which were responsible for the dismantling of environmental agencies and led to a very deliberate dysfunctionality of the environmental monitoring agencies and to a nearly paralysis of the entire finding systems, for instance, to punish environmental criminals. And civil society has done a great job in mapping what are the decrees and measures which are problematic. So I think his work will be completely, the civil society will be able to help the government to that regard. But secondly, I think we are likely to see more robust and larger law enforcement field operations with the intention to send a very clear message that criminal practices will no longer be encouraged or tolerated. And I believe this operation will likely involve not only environmental agencies and the police, but also the armed forces. And hopefully they will focus on areas where the criminal practices are having a very significant impact upon local populations, for instance, in indigenous lands that have been invaded by illegal gold miners, which have a series of security and health implications for these communities. But finally, it will be essential to privatize the existing environmental agencies, and this will entail recruiting more public servants with technical expertise in the environmental area, but also providing them with adequate tools and equipment. And of course, Lula will also have to fulfill one of his campaign promises, which was the creation of a ministry on indigenous and traditional people. And all these measures will require resources and consequently negotiating with Congress, which could be problematic, including because the proposal for the next year's budget, which has already been submitted by the current administration, envisages a 6.4% cut in the funding for the Ministry of Environment. So you have a situation that you need to do a lot to recover what was in the past and possibly improve it, because it has never been perfect. But you have a challenge with regards to budget. We know our Congress has a very strong presence of agribusiness lobby. So I'd say that in addition to negotiating with Congress, he will need to look for alternatives as well. And in that regard, I think the Amazon Fund and other international cooperation mechanisms could play an important role in helping fill up this gap.
And on that vein, Hussein, in what ways can the Lula administration work further with the international community on these global issues? And I'm already going to start bringing in some questions from the audience. There are some questions here about special partnerships that Brazil could have with other South American countries, as well as in terms of the OECD process.
Well, I mean, about the OECD process, actually, the president has been, as far as I know, very cautious to talk about it, as well as member of his team. First and foremost, because people doesn't know exactly in which level the negotiation are, right? So who is leading that is Bolsonaro's government. So there is no way to make any assessment about it before to get access to the document, to read everything and to analyze every and each aspect of this negotiation, and each committee within the OECD works in a different velocity, right? It's not at the same at the same velocity, right? So each one has its own way. Well, so I think as far as I know, talking with people close to the president, they don't have either an opinion in favor or against this process. Actually, what they are very cautious. They want to analyze all aspects, and based on that, they will decide if that fulfill the Brazilian national interest, and that fulfill also the requirement of the necessity of the Brazilian population, right, to be part of this organization, but without addressing the main issues of the population. So why for to be part of this organization, right? So we have to analyze in a systematic way. Regard reconnecting with the world, I think what we need is someone with credibility to reconnect. That is first. The reconnection with the world depends ultimately on someone that has credibility, and that Bolsonaro, he doesn't have that anyway. That's why Brazil is isolated. Brazil is isolated due to two aspects: lack of credibility of the president himself and destructive social policies. On the other hand, both combined basically jeopardize Brazil's interests worldwide and regionally. So the world has experimented President Lula administration in the past, and he has been vocal in several key world issues, and I believe that he will soonly will recover Brazil's reputation and image across the world. But what will be the key priorities of his foreign policy? I think he have said, like, South America will be a key region for the Brazilian national interest, a very balanced relation between the rivalry between US and China, because Brazil cannot take side in this competitive process except to try to play a role that benefit all parts in this equation. I think regard to the EU-Mercosur trade agreement, that that is an important file, and I believe the foreign minister and the Minister of Trade and the Minister of Finance, they will look closely to it, and especially the Minister of Environment, because that will require a a wider articulation involve others. But you have to remember that this agreement does not depend only on Brazil, right? Because the Mercosur is not only Brazil. You have another partners, and we have to see what will be the demand of the other partner in the implementation of this agreement, right? Especially Argentina, that and especially Uruguay with Uruguayan demand to flexibilization of the Mercosur trade deal. So I mean, looking to the future of the foreign policy, whatever would be the edge, whatever would be the framework, that will be much better than the current one, because we don't have any foreign policy at all, right? So we have only basically in isolation, and that has been seen that in COP27. And I think I'm highly confident that President Lula will address a innovative and a creative new foreign policy.
Hussein, on that note, we also received a question from the audience about what to expect from Lula regarding Russia's war on Ukraine. Is there any kind of change that we can expect from Brazil's approach to that war with Lula?
Well, I think President Lula have talked about it already, either in private or publicly, about this this aspect. He never endorsed the war, a war activity or the use of violence. As well, he never endorsed whatever intervention without the United Nations Security Council resolution. So, my opinion, President Lula has been very cautious on tackling that aspects. Accordingly to the Brazilian Constitution, aspects such as sovereignty, self-determination are very important, and whatever decision will be made under the observation of these two aspects.
Marina, we were talking a little bit more about foreign policy in general, but one of the points that I think we all have been making is the fact that the incoming government will face some challenges in Congress, given a more right-leaning congressional composition. How will the incoming Lula administration work with Congress on pushing forward its key priorities? How could the first 100 days in office determine the governability of this administration? And already answering one of the questions from the audience as well is, especially from these politicians who believe that Bolsonaro won or that the elections were not accurate, can we expect some kind of movement to inhibit some of these goals that Lula has and push those forward?
So I think first, Lula wants to show that he is on board for the negotiations with Congress. So he is the main character in his government to do these talks. He's been like that. He was helping during the impeachment process with Dilma. Did not work, but okay, it was a political effort that he made. So he wants to show to everybody that he is on board for these negotiations. And we saw that in two acts those past few days. One, Lula went to Brasilia in person to negotiate what we are calling the PEC, a PEC da transição, which is an amendment for the constitution to permit Lula governments to spend money in social programs beyond the spending caps for the next 4 years. The Congress is being tough about it because they want something to pay back, so Congress is being like that. Lula knows that, and Lula went there in Brasilia in person to negotiate that. And two, and maybe the most important movement until now, Lula agreed to support the re-election of Arthur Lira as the Speaker of the House. Arthur Lira was an ally of Bolsonaro who controls the Congress, and he led the main projects, and he decides what will be voted in Congress or not. Basically, it's what Artur Lira does. So Lula knows that it's crucial to avoid fighting with Artur Lira in those first 100 days. So it's better to try to negotiate with him. And Lula showed that he's gonna do that. So Lula is negotiating with Artur Lira, and he knows that Centrão will ask for a lot of things. So those parties that are together supporting whatever the government is, we call this bloc as Centrão, they will ask a lot of things. It's been like that since forever, and Lula was the president twice. So he knows that, and he knows how this works. In Brazil, we don't have midterms as in the US, so there is no possibility of changing in Congress during the next 4 years. It is what it is. So of course, the first 100 days are important. Lula wants to show that he came to change, as he's saying, but there is a long way to go. And he knows that. It's gonna be tough. It's gonna be tough. Like it's gonna be day by day, week by week, year by year. Even this PEC da Transição, he's trying to make it happen for 4 years for his whole government, and apparently he will not do it. He has to arrange something and do for 2 years, for example, the expenses for the Bolsa Familia, which is the social program. So I think my opinion is that Lula knows that it's gonna be tough. And it's going to be tough, but he's on board for negotiations. And Dilma was not, Bolsonaro first was not too, then he was doing something not like this secret budget to try to pay for support. So Lula knows the channels, and he's trying to show that he is on board for negotiations. And like this move about supporting Artur Lira, I think it's the most important movement until now in political terms, I mean.
Marina, trying to answer also another question from the audience in terms of economic policies in general. This is something that, as you were mentioning, Lula knows that he will face some of these challenges. And you already mentioned some key economic policy priorities for the Lula administration. How hard is it going to be for him to pass those? How early on in his government is he going to try to address those issues? And especially because the core of his campaign was focused on targeting poverty, targeting inequality, targeting hunger. How is he going to make that happen first?
Mm-hmm. This is his main goal. He's talking about that every time in public with his allies. He wants to put poor people on the budget again. And he thinks that this way he can not bring back Brazil, because Brazil is super divided now, but he thinks the contest in Brazil will be better if he can do it. And those policies about poor people, about social programs, about hunger, they are easy to pass in Congress because all the representatives, all the senators, they want to help their bases, their best bases, and their supporters. And they supporters, they are poor because the majority of Brazil are poor. Okay, so it's easier to pass those kind of projects. So I think it's gonna happen soon, but not 100%. How Lula wants to, you know, so we will see some some changes, like let's say that. So instead of 4 years, like spending all the money over Bolsa Familia without the spending caps, it's gonna be 2 years. So he will be able to do a lot and soon, because it's his main goal, it's his priority. In Congress, they are able to do it. They are willing to do it because poor people has to be a priority because they're voters too, you know. So we will see some changes over the projects, but they will be approved, and I think soon, but again with some changes.
Looking now into the U.S.-Brazil relations, right? We are here in Washington D.C. and we are talking about Brazil in particular. Who's saying the United States and Brazil enjoy strong and lasting diplomatic relations. They have been based on pragmatic and mutually beneficial priorities, such as trade and investment, climate, science and technology, security, and others. How will the new Lula administration seek to deepen U.S.-Brazil cooperation? The United States will likely welcome a stronger stance from Brazil against Russia and China, for example. Can we expect Brazil's position to change in some of these geopolitical matters?
Well, I mean, every relation among brothers has up and downs, right? And this relation in particular has more up than downs. And the expectation is to keep having more ups than downs. So, I mean, both sides, they are already in contact. President Lula have already met U.S. officials, as well as U.S. officials have met some Brazilian important politicians from Lula's camp. I mean, so far so good. The relation among both sides is evolving as expected, and there's several things in common between Biden's agenda and Lula's agenda, right? So climate change will be an important issue, which I think both countries will have a lot to cooperate on that in the next 4 years. I would say another important aspect, it's about the regional stability, and especially in what related in Venezuela. There's a lot of room, and even in the past, between when Lula was president and Obama was at the White House, so Brazil and US, they have cooperated very well vis-a-vis the regional stability, and I think that will definitely will be one of the main topics of this relation. Beside that, we have to discuss two other issues that they are important: migration, and that is very sensitive issue to the US as well as to Brazil, and also cooperation in the field of technology, right? So if we want to look toward the future, Brazil requires more than ever to update its industrial platform, and the cooperation in this field will be very important for the Brazilian national development. Beside that, I mean, as far as the Brazilian economy start to grow, as much as Brazil and US, especially from January beyond, a bilateral meeting among head of states will open up a lot of new opportunities, either for direct foreign investment, either for looking toward a more complementarity within the trade field, right? So that said, I'm quite optimistic about the future of these bilateral relations. In what regard to Russia or whatever, I think we shouldn't mix up the bilateral relation with a wider geopolitical problem, right? Perhaps Brazil national interest has different nuances, which sometimes is quite different than US national interests, especially in geopolitical aspects. So we have to be very clear about what is important for us, what is important for Brazil. Brazil has always pursued stability and peaceful negotiation, whatever conflict, and especially under the rule of the international rule of law. That has been our tradition since the end of the Second World War, right? So, and I think that will be our main. That is our main doctrine, and that how we will pursue with a new foreign policy. As I said, in the Ukraine-Russia equation, Brazil national interests doesn't rely necessarily with all aspects of US national interests. There's some common boundaries, but there's also certain divergences about how to address the problem, right? And having different divergency to address the problem, that doesn't mean that we agree on what's going on, right? But it's mean that the way how the problem should be solved require more, perhaps, diplomatic trends rather than the use of force.
Mayara, in addition to some of these key aspects of how US-Brazil relations can be deepened, President Biden has prioritized more ambitious climate goals from the United States, trying to take on leadership role globally. In what ways can we expect to see President Biden and President Lula working together towards this more ambitious climate agenda? What would this agenda entail?
Well, as Hussein was saying, there's been some meetings between those parties. Both Lula and Marina Silva, who's former Minister of Environment, is now part of the transition team. They have met with the US Special Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, during COP27. And one issue that has come up in both conversations was the possibility of the US joining the Amazon Fund. And I think ensuring US financial contributions could not only help attract additional donor countries, but also would send a quite important message that these two nations are ready to cooperate towards the protection of forests and environmental issues more broadly. But in addition to these funding arrangements, which I think would also involve the US private sector, so not only the government, I think we are likely to see a stronger cooperation in law enforcement initiatives aimed at disrupting criminal organizations, especially in the Amazon. And in that regard, it's being reported that the US is currently holding discussions with Brazil's current administration to look, for instance, at options to impose sanctions against environmental criminals in Brazil. And I think this is a topic that needs to be looked at quite carefully, and it might encounter some resistance from the incoming administration. Firstly, because Brazil traditionally opposes unilateral sanctions and considers that the UN Security Council is the only forum with the legitimacy to impose legally binding sanctions upon other countries. But secondly, because imposing penalties that have been talked about, such as freezing assets and prohibiting Brazilian companies that have perpetrated environmental crimes from trading and carrying out business with US companies. At first, this might sound quite appealing, but I think the issue it's quite complex. And as I said, it needs to be carefully analyzed because it touches upon considerations of sovereignty, considerations of presumption of innocence. But finally, I think we need to bear in mind that some of these companies often account for significant portions of the food supply globally. And such a punishment, I'd say, could severely disrupt some of the food supply chains and lead to price increases that ultimately tend to affect more vulnerable countries and populations, and which some of them were already suffering from the increasing food prices associated, for instance, with the crisis in Ukraine. So despite these considerations with regard to the possibility of sanctioning environmental criminals in Brazil, which seem to be ongoing, I'd say that overall I agree with my colleagues when we think that there is a favorable environment to enhance Brazil-US cooperation, not only in the climate area. I think Hussein has covered some of the key aspects. I would like to add the issue, I think, of fake news and the spread of misinformation and the impact that this has had in democratic institutions. I think this is a common challenge that both countries have faced that have led to illegal or illegitimate, undemocratic protests, as Marina was saying, but also to violent episodes, both in Brazil, but also in the United States. So I think both Biden and Lula were aware of the problems that the fake news and misinformation can cause to democracy, and hopefully there will also be an area for cooperation. But yeah, I think there's a lot to be done, and we just need to make sure we achieve the right balance to ensure that the cooperation is mutually beneficial for both countries, but also for their wider planet and environment, and so on.
Marina, Mayara actually touched on the exact topic that I wanted to ask you. It's kind of how we began the conversation. We were talking about the common challenges that Brazil and the United States and democracies globally really have been facing in recent years. Brazil and the US are both strong democracies, but that doesn't mean democratic institutions can be strengthened. How do you think that the Lula administration might look to strengthen the democratic process in Brazil, and how can US and Brazil learn from one another on this front?
Yeah, no, I'm glad that Mayara brought this point about fake news, because during the interview that me and John Lee Anderson we did with Lula 2 weeks ago, it was clear for me that poor people on the budget, Amazon, and fake news are his priorities. Of course, Amazon and fake news in terms of foreign policy. He wants to develop some international rules that can be used by countries without Congress changing them. You know what I mean? So like the countries can decide a new rule about fake news, and then they could put this like formally going on, and not like each Congress in each country can make your law about fake news, you know, so it's a concern. But I think like about democracy in the US and Brazil, first Lula needs to take office and start his government. The institutions in Brazil have been showing that they are protecting democracy, but Lula also needs to rebuild in my opinion, some of them, like the ones to protect indigenous people and minorities. He also needs to build up an atmosphere where we journalists can work, environmentalists can work, human rights workers can work. Those people need to feel safe in Brazil working, you know, and we journalists, we don't feel safe in Brazil under Bolsonaro government. So I think he needs to build up this atmosphere, you know, and also, as I said, rebuild some of the institutions about indigenous people, minorities, and this will help democracy in Brazil. The US can help with money over the environment, partnership, the fund, etc., for example. But in terms of the big picture democracy, I will say, and maybe it's something bold, but I think the US has more to learn from Brazil than the opposite. You know, those two elections, Biden versus Trump and Lula versus Bolsonaro, prove that a more centralized system and universal access to voting like we have here in Brazil can be less vulnerable to attacks like those that Trump and Bolsonaro have done, you know. So the TSE, the electoral court here, is protecting our elections. So I think the US has more to learn to Brazil about mandatory votes, voting rights. So here in Brazil, we have this more safe, and I think the US can learn from us. But of course, those two countries needs to have a partnership about democracy, of course. And Lula is looking forward to talk to Biden about it, and he was planning to go to the US before the inauguration day, but because of the PEC da transição, he couldn't go. So I think he's trying to rebuild this bridge between Brazil and the US, because during Trump, Bolsonaro and Trump, they like to say that they were friends, etc., but nothing super huge or big happened in terms of partnership between like those two countries. So I think Lula is looking forward to do that. It's not a priority. Again, the US is not a priority, but I think Brazil will show that he is a player again, he is back, and he wants to talk to Biden about all those things, democracy, fake news, and etc.
On that note, I wanted to ask one final question since we are running out of time. But if you could, in one word, describe what you're watching from now until Inauguration Day, Marina, what would it be?
Alexandre de Moraes. the head, the head of electoral court in Brazil, what he's going to do from here to January 1st, it's important to what's going to happen about the protests, about Bolsonaro, about Bolsonaro's party, about all the attempts of these golpistas. Yes.
Mayara, what do you think the top priority should be for Lula in terms of environment?
Reducing deforestation. I think we can only help reconquer Brazil credibility internationally if we show results in deforestation and in protection of indigenous people and all those protecting the environment.
Hussein, lastly, where will President Lula go first? Which country is he going to visit first once he's inaugurated?
Well, only himself knows about that. I don't know. It's one thing where I think he should go is one thing, and what he think he must go is different thing, right? So I don't know. Only himself knows what he has in his head, and more than anyone, he knows where to go and why to go. So I think he's an experienced politician. Sometimes people ask me, oh, who's gonna be his foreign minister? And I always says, Lula's foreign minister is Lula himself, right? So, I mean, that is the answer.
Thank you so much. I wanted to thank Marina, Mayara, Hussein. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you everyone for participating in today's conversation, and I hope to see you soon. Have a good one.
Bye-bye. Good to see you all.